Hello, I'm Lynn Bondurant, and welcome once again to our series about America's civilian efforts in air and space during a quarter century. During this 7th episode, we cover National Aeronautics and Space Administration activities from 1969, when men first walked on the moon, and we cover 1970 as well. We begin in 1969 when Apollo 11 lands on the moon.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
Those simple words, the Eagle has landed, mark the culmination of a goal set in 1961. It also signaled the beginning of a new era, when for the first time, man walked on a planet beyond his own. 1969, an eventful year in aeronautics and space. The moon was not the only planet to receive an earthly visitor in 1969. Two unmanned spacecraft, Mariner 6 and 7, flew within 2,000 miles of Mars. One was launched so it would fly in a north-south direction, the other east to west, taking pictures and recording scientific data as they traveled along. Here, in step-printed form, is what Mariner 7 actually saw as it approached Mars. The photographs revealed Mars to be different from both the Earth and the Moon. While craters were observed in some areas, one vast stretch of over 1,200 miles appeared to have none. Temperatures at the polar cap indicated it is made up of solid carbon dioxide, dry ice. The Mariner scientific sensors provided detailed information on the Martian atmosphere and surface temperatures, and paved the way for future flights. In meteorology, another TIROS operational satellite was placed into orbit for the Environmental Science Service Agency. The new TIROS, which sends back pictures of the Earth's cloud cover, makes early storm warnings and everyday weather predictions routine. Nimbus 3, a 1,360-pound experimental weather satellite, is being utilized as a test bed to prove out new meteorological instruments. Temperature measurements made by the big weather satellite are helping map the weather of the northern hemisphere. Another experimental satellite launched was ATS-5, Applications Technology Satellite. As a result of an agreement signed this year between the United States and India, NASA will launch an ATS in 1972, which will broadcast instructional television directly into thousands of Indian villages, providing, among other things, programs on modern agricultural techniques. This is an artist's concept of a lifting body. At NASA's Flight Research Center in California, test pilots have made more than 150 lifting body flights. The wingless craft are considered to be forerunners of ships that can fly a space mission and then return to Earth like an airplane. The rocket-powered HL-10 has already flown 1.5 times the speed of sound after being dropped in midair. Because a lifting body can make ground landings, they become very attractive as low-cost, reusable space shuttles of the future. They're called VSTOL, vertical or steep takeoff and landing planes, aircraft that may one day make short-haul intercity transports a reality. NASA's Langley and Ames research centers have been studying the problems that vertical landing planes might encounter at terminals where big jets are taking off and landing. What's the best way to bring vertically landing planes into a congested airport without interfering with an already busy traffic pattern? Should there be separate runways, or can they land as the bigger jets make their final approaches? What type of poor weather instrumentation will they need? These are some of the questions the current research will help to answer. There were 4 manned Apollo flights in 1969. The first of these was Apollo 9 with astronauts McDivitt, Scott, and Schweikart piloting. Theirs was an Earth orbital mission, a mission to check out for the first time all the various spacecraft systems needed to fly round trip to the moon. Through a series of intricate maneuvers, they dress rehearsed for the lunar flights to follow. During 10 days and 152 orbits of the Earth, they rendezvoused and docked with the lunar landing craft, checked out manual guidance systems, fired the lander's rocket engines, and practiced a space rescue between the lunar module and command ship. Russell Schweikart spent about 45 minutes outside in a spacesuit during this exercise. For the men of Apollo 9, a job well done. The big pieces of lunar space gear had worked, and worked well. All was in readiness for the next test. Apollo 10. Its mission, fly to the moon and simulate a lunar landing. And so they did. While astronaut John Young orbited alone in the command module, codenamed Charlie Brown, astronauts Stafford and Cernan, flying in Snoopy, the lunar module, began making close passes at the moon. The 2 space pilots did everything but land. They fired the descent engines, lowering them to 50,000 feet above the surface, and similarly tested out the ascent rocket, which would send the moon landing Apollo 11 crew back into lunar orbit for the return home. As they passed over the Sea of Tranquility at an altitude of 10 miles, closer than any human had ever traveled, they reported back to Mission Control Houston that the landing site was smooth. The stage was now set for the lunar landing 2 months later.
Sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour.
Columbia and Eagle were on their way. At stake, nearly 10 years of research, development, and fabrication. Some 20,000 companies throughout the United States participated in the building of the Saturn V rocket and Apollo spacecraft, which carried astronauts Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins on their historic journey to the moon. Theirs was a journey like no other, for they were the first to set foot on the lunar surface. This was the sight viewed by over 300 million people around the world as the 2 men tested their moon legs and began setting their scientific experiments. After 22 hours, they headed for a rendezvous with Mike Collins and the trip home to Earth. Because of the possibility of contamination from the moon, the 3 astronauts were quarantined for nearly 3 weeks. At the same time, scientists began looking at their newly acquired lunar samples, the first opportunity anyone had had to look at something from a different body in the solar system. Samples were given to 142 scientists, both here and abroad, for intensive study. Results will be released in January when the group gathers in Houston to go over their findings. Shortly after returning from the moon, the crew of Apollo 11 began another journey that lasted 40 days. At the request of the President, they embarked on a goodwill mission covering some 46,000 miles with visits to 22 countries. From Mexico City to Brussels, Belgrade to Kinshasa, Bombay to Tokyo. The lunar trio was warmly and enthusiastically received by millions of people, giving them a chance to share their experiences firsthand. For the second time in 1 year, American astronauts headed for the moon. While astronaut Dick Gordon orbited in the command module Yankee Clipper, awaiting their return, Pete Conrad and Alan Bean flew the lunar module Intrepid toward a touchdown in the ocean of storms. A pinpoint landing was critical to this mission and all future flights. With this in mind, the two space pilots set the landing craft down within 600 feet of the unmanned Surveyor 3, which had landed there 3 years before. In addition to inspecting and removing pieces of the Surveyor for return to Earth, the pair collected about 90 pounds of lunar samples. They also set up 6 scientific experiments, which among other things will record moonquakes, measure the lunar atmosphere, and analyze the solar wind. En route back from the moon, the 3 astronauts witnessed and photographed for the first time an eclipse of the sun by the Earth. The splashdown of Apollo 12 was almost as precise as their moon landing. The Yankee Clipper landed 3½ miles from the carrier Hornet. Space science, advanced research, aeronautics, and the first manned landings and exploration of the moon. 1969, a year to remember.
And that is how much of NASA's 1969 looks on film. The following year, 1970, is the year of the first Earth Day, when millions of persons demonstrate against pollution. And 1970 is an eventful year for NASA.
March 7th, scientists took a good look at the sun. The occasion, a total solar eclipse. An event of such magnitude will not occur again until 2024, 54 years from now.
Another Tyros operational weather satellite was launched in 1970. It's looking at the Earth's cloud cover and returns daily weather information.
Orbited also Nimbus, an advanced weather researcher.
2 communication satellites were successfully launched as part of a global communication satellite system.
In aeronautics, NASA continued its research in wake turbulence. These smoke tower tests show how tornado-like patterns of air are churned up as a large plane passes by, causing potential hazards for lighter aircraft.
NASA's Earth Resources planes made high-altitude pictures of Peru's devastating earthquake, pictures that will contribute to the remote sensing of future natural disasters. They also made temperature and color measurements over the tuna-rich fishing grounds near Oregon, an effort to assist Pacific Coast fishing fleets to increase their catch.
While en route to the moon, the 3rd manned lunar landing attempt was canceled when an oxygen tank ruptured. The Apollo 13 astronauts, Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert, were then safely recovered from the Pacific Ocean on April 17th. Trying out life support systems for long-duration space flights of the future, 4 college students from California spent 90 days confined in a space station simulator. The crew drank water and breathed oxygen reclaimed from their body wastes and emerged after their confinement showing no apparent ill effects.
Beginning October 18, Soviet cosmonauts Andrei Nikolaev and Vitaly Sevastyanov toured the U.S. and several NASA field centers. During that same month, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to study ways that American and Russian spaceships could meet and join in space.
Those are some of NASA's 1970 highlights. Let's put the next year, 1971, into historical perspective. 1971 is the year anthropologists discover a lost tribe in a Philippine jungle, so overgrown that the tribesmen had never seen the moon. And in 1971, NASA continues to make progress.
3 Mariner spacecraft have flown by Mars in recent years. They were fleeting glimpses, and the craft did not fly close to the mysterious red planet. 2,000 miles was the closest. On November 13th, Mariner 9 changed all that. As its braking rocket fired, the picture-taking Mariner swung into orbit around Mars, an orbit allowing the spacecraft to come within 850 miles of the surface. As it circles the planet twice a day, it will photograph and gather data for at least 3 months, mapping 70% of the planet's surface. The 2 small moons of Mars, Phobos and Deimos, will also be closely scrutinized. Mars appears to have gone or is going through some type of planetary evolution. The main question is whether it is an evolving planet or a decaying one. Mars is more Earth-like than any other planet. Its clouds, seasonal changes, and polar ice caps are intriguing. As the Mariner 9 returns its vast accumulation of data and pictures, scientists will have their first close-up view and hopefully clues to the history and evolution of Mars, the Earth, and the solar system. The Sun is roughly 10,000 times larger than Earth. Its very presence affects our daily lives. To learn more about this and about how it affects our environment, NASA orbited 3 unmanned scientific explorers. IMP, Interplanetary Monitoring Platform, was the first. The versatile IMP, 8th in a series, is exploring interplanetary space and the outer fringes of the Earth's magnetosphere. It also provides warnings of possible solar flare radiation hazards to moon-bound astronauts. With the Naval Research Laboratory, NASA launched the SOLRAD satellite. It too studies the sun's radiation and records the disturbances which can disrupt long-range communications and navigation systems. This computer-type picture shows the sun's disk and inner corona. It was returned by OSO 7, the latest in the orbiting solar observatory series. OSO is trying to determine the direct effects solar flares have on the environment, weather, and communications. Earth is surrounded by the magnetosphere, an enormous teardrop-shaped region formed by the solar wind, a supersonic stream of particles blowing on the Earth's magnetic field. It is in this region that a craft like the small scientific satellite does its job. Its mission is to investigate the causes of worldwide magnetic disturbances and map in detail the ways in which the motion of these particles changes with time. Stratoscope 2, a large astronomical telescope, was hoisted into the sky by a giant balloon from the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. This was the 8th Stratoscope flight. Its goal? Obtain sharper pictures of certain galaxies, nebulae, and the planet Saturn above the distortion of the Earth's atmosphere. The 4-ton telescope is so accurate it can distinguish 2 objects 30 miles apart from 1,000 miles away. Scientists will be working on the data returned by Stratoscope 2 for the next several months. NASA used planes like this in checking out cameras and sensing equipment to be carried on future Earth Resources satellites and the manned orbiting Skylab space station. An interesting side benefit took place this summer as the specially equipped planes were used to detect southern corn blight during the 1971 growing season. High-altitude infrared photos were taken and then analyzed by Purdue University and the Department of Agriculture. These photographs were used to determine the extent and degree of corn blight. At the request of the local government, survey missions were flown over the island of Jamaica. Much of the water from Jamaica's 200 inches of rainfall never reaches its cities. It is believed that submarine springs carry a portion of the water offshore into the ocean. This was indicated by the preliminary analysis. Here is one of a pair of high-altitude aircraft converted for use in Earth resource surveys. They are operating from NASA's Ames Research Center near San Francisco. The data collected by these flights is being used to simulate future remote sensing Earth resources satellites. Satellites that will be used to study agriculture, forestry, geology, oceanography, and urban development. Test pilots at NASA's Flight Research Center in California flew a plane with a new type wing this year. Called the supercritical wing, it is shaped quite differently from conventional wings. The new design alters the flow of air over the top of the wing, allowing an aircraft to fly faster, farther, and at a lower operating cost. This sleek black plane, the YF-12, capable of flying 2,000 miles per hour, made 25 test flights. The joint NASA Air Force program is studying problems associated with propulsion, in-flight stopping and restarting of engines, heating, and structural dynamics. The research is aimed at furthering the development and operations of future civil and military aircraft. Eight times the M2 lifting body was carried aloft and dropped over the dry lake desert in central California. The wingless M2 and other lifting body types are the research forerunners of craft like the proposed shuttle that could fly a space mission and then return through the Earth's atmosphere and land like an airplane. A new flight program began at NASA's Ames Research Center with the X-14B vertical takeoff and landing plane. Equipped with an onboard digital computer, the X-14 serves as a flying flight simulator by duplicating in advance the piloting qualities of proposed new planes. The Ames Center is also responsible for doing research on short takeoff and landing aircraft. This is one of the planes used to test new concepts, the OV-10A Bronco. The United States is very interested in developing a short takeoff and landing plane for use as an intercity transport in the nation's busy metropolitan air corridors. Attacking the jet noise problem at its source, engineers at the Lewis Research Center in Cleveland are supervising tests of a quieter jet engine. The goal is to develop an engine that will be 15 to 20 decibels quieter than present aircraft engines. The scene is Cape Canaveral, Friday, May 5th, 1961. It was on this date that astronaut Alan B. Shepard became the first American to be rocketed into space. Ten years later, January 31st, 1971, Alan B. Shepard made his second space flight, this time as commander of Apollo 14, the country's third moon landing. With astronauts Mitchell and Russa accompanying Shepard, Apollo 14 marked the beginning of large-scale use of the moon for science. These are some of the 94 pounds of lunar rocks returned from the moon's ancient hills of Fra Mauro by Apollo 14. They are beginning to tell scientists a story 3.5 billion years old. From them, we are learning about the early history of not only the moon, but other planets as well. The Earth, Mars, even Venus and Mercury. This is the view seen by Apollo 15 astronauts, Scott and Irwin, as their spacecraft Falcon arched over the Hadley Rill, located in the foothills of the moon's Apennine Mountains.
8 feet -1. Contact. Man. Okay, Houston, the Falcon is on the plane at Hadley. Roger, roger, Falcon.
Theirs was to be the most extensive exploration of the moon ever made. To prepare for the July mission, Scott and Irwin practiced on similar Earth terrain at the Rio Grande Gorge in New Mexico. They also spent many hours getting used to the lunar rover. Here's what it actually looked like to the moon riders as they drove their four-wheel car over 16 miles of lunar surface. As a result of their increased mobility, the pair returned 180 pounds of lunar rocks and deep core samples. After liftoff, and while in lunar orbit, the trio launched a small scientific satellite called the sub-satellite to study the area around the moon. As they headed earthward, astronaut Al Worden climbed outside the spacecraft and retrieved film from a pair of mapping cameras. The scientific instruments left by Apollo 15 and the photographs and samples they returned are giving us a real understanding of the moon in relationship to the Earth and the Sun. We asked Mr. Dale Myers, NASA's Director of Manned Spaceflight, to give us a status report on Skylab, the United States' first space station.
This year has been a big year for Skylab. All of the hardware for the program is coming into focus. Our qualification programs are underway. The major elements of the Skylab system are in the final positions of manufacturing and checkout. Now, one of the more important things to me about Skylab is it gives us an opportunity to learn more about man's capability to work and live in space.
(1971), a year of significant achievement in aeronautics and space. These have been the highlights.
Please join us next time for Episode 8 of 25 Years of Progress, when we cover NASA highlights from 1972 and 1973. I'm Lynn Bondurant.
Roger, Columbia, on a roll. Columbia, Houston, you're go at 40. Roger, go at 40.
'72, which will broadcast instructional television directly into thousands of Indian villages, providing, among other things, programs on modern agricultural techniques. This is an artist's concept of a lifting body. At NASA's Flight Research Center in California, test pilots have made more than 150 lifting body flights. The wingless craft are considered to be forerunners of ships that can fly a space mission and then return to Earth like an airplane. The rocket-powered HL-10 has already flown 1.5 times the speed of sound after being dropped in midair. Because a lifting body can make ground landings, they become very attractive as low-cost, reusable space shuttles of the future. They're called VSTOL. The moon was not the only planet to receive an earthly visitor in 1969. Two unmanned spacecraft, Mariner 6 and 7, flew within 2,000 miles of Mars. One was launched so it would fly in a north-south direction, the other east to west, taking pictures and recording scientific data as they traveled along. Here, in step-printed form, is what Mariner 7 actually saw as it approached Mars. The photographs revealed Mars to be different from both the Earth and the Moon. While craters were observed in some areas, one vast stretch of over 1,200 miles appeared to have none. Temperatures at the polar cap indicated it is made up of solid carbon dioxide, dry ice. The Mariner's scientific sensors provided detailed information on the Martian atmosphere and surface temperatures and paved the way for future flights.
America's civilian efforts in air and space during a quarter century. During this 7th episode, we cover National Aeronautics and Space Administration activities from 1969 when men first walked on the moon. And we cover 1970 as well. We begin in 1969 when Apollo 11 lands on the moon.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
Those simple words, the Eagle has landed, mark the culmination of a goal set in 1961. It also signaled the beginning of a new era, when for the first time, man walked on a planet beyond his own. 1969, an eventful year in aeronautics and space. In meteorology, another TIROS operational satellite was placed into orbit for the Environmental Science Service Agency. The new TIROS, which sends back pictures of the Earth's cloud cover, makes early storm warnings and everyday weather predictions routine. Nimbus 3, a 1,360-pound experimental weather satellite, is being utilized as a test bed to prove out new meteorological instruments. Temperature measurements made by the big weather satellite are helping map the weather of the northern hemisphere. Another experimental satellite launched was ATS-5, Applications Technology Satellite. As a result of an agreement signed this year between the United States and India, NASA will launch an ATS in 19...
Hello, I'm Lynn Bondurant, and welcome once again to our series about America.